Hello, I am Bree Carroll, the 2020-2021 Armed Forces Insurance Air Force Spouse of the Year. Welcome to Let's Talk. I am excited to host this second year of our Military Family Town Hall with discussions on race and the military family. This celebration happens to occur annually during Juneteenth. And I love that today's discussion is focused on what have we learned. And it seems to be a great item to note that Juneteenth has been considered to be the newest federal holiday. So happy Juneteenth to each of you. The takeaway here, as what did we learn, is the importance of commemorating and recognizing our accomplishments, the diversity that we have in this nation, and celebrating the history of liberty that is brought to each individual. The first year that I hosted the Military Family Town Hall, Let's Talk, was in 2020. During that time, there was a lot of racial tension due to the murder of George Floyd. From that incident, a lot of conversations were sparked in our nation and in our DoD. Leadership took steps and efforts to open the doors to conversations that were long overdue. Today, in 2021, we are going to revisit some of those discussions, the things that we have learned from them, and the next steps that we think that we should take to continue the progress of this dialogue. This year's conversation will be shorter than last year, but please go back and listen to the amazing insight that each of our 2020 speakers provided in our conversation. For context, in 2021, I had the privilege of sitting down and speaking with Dr. Ingrid Herrera Yee, Miss Charlinda Scales, and also my own family, Lieutenant Colonel Kendrick Carroll and Captain Donovan Carroll. All right, everyone, I am super excited for our conversation with Dr. Ingrid Herrera Yee. She is a mental health and policy SME. She is a speaker, a writer, an academic, a researcher. And the reason why we really wanted to have this conversation with her is because she specializes in diversity, equity, and inclusion as a professional in this space. So we are thrilled to speak with her on this question for our Military Family Town Hall on race. What have we learned? Okay, so Dr. Yee, thank you so much for being here and joining me on this conversation, a much needed conversation that needs to continue on race in the military community. And I'm super excited that you get to lend your perspective as a SME, as a professional in the field. So kind of our lead-in question is, what are our lessons learned from what we saw in 2020 till now? What were some big takeaways for our nation and specifically in our military community?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. Yeah, 2020 was the year. And, events last year really brought to light, not just amongst the military, but nationwide, that, we are still very much grappling with, racism, systemic racism, and that, the military is not immune. We learned so much about the lack of diversity, for example, among leadership in the military. When you talk about, for example, the fact that about 20% of the military is Black, and yet only 2 of 41 4-star generals and admirals are Black. That's just one example of, needing to see someone who looks like you in leadership. That is so, so important.
Yeah.
And, for our military families as well, I know for myself as a Latina, having moved 7 times and, having been heavily involved in FRGs, and with our military families. And the same thing, at least in my experience and of those that I know, it's rare to see someone who looks like you, someone,
Right.
person of color, in even military family leadership. You look at, our um, nonprofit organizations or those who represent us for the most part. We don't see people like us. We don't see ourselves in leadership.
Yeah.
And so, that really came to the forefront last year, and rightfully so. And it was amazing to see that the focus, the spotlight was on, trying to mitigate, all of the negative effects of this. Because you think about myself as a clinical psychologist, I think about mental health and stigma, and racial and ethnic, everyday microaggressions that occur for our families, for our service members. Those are like, death by 1,000 cuts. So you are faced with these issues, and they start to wear on, mental health, suicide risk, all kinds of negative sort of experiences. So the fact that, sadly, it came from a very tragic event, but it brought to the forefront just how important it is to talk about racism and bias, and the fact that there are unequal opportunities for our families, for our service members of color. That is vital to the conversation. And it really brought about, that focus. Now we have some of our leaders are African American, our Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, for example, who's doing a lot of work in his office to
Yeah.
bring attention to these issues. And then we've got our Air Force General Chief, Charles Brown Jr.,
Yes.
who's also, talking about the experiences that he went through, even as a leader at his level. If he's not wearing the uniform, he still faces those microaggressions and even,
Right.
more sort of in your face experiences of racism. So, we wouldn't have heard these stories. We likely wouldn't have had, our Secretary of Defense as a Black man, if we weren't talking about these issues.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, last year really brought sort of a reckoning, particularly, when we look at what happened January 6th, here in DC, a lot of, we're taking our blinders off. We're
Yes.
seeing a lot of the ugliness, and that's hard to see and it's hard to talk about, but it is so vitally important because things left in the dark aren't dealt with. And
Yes.
so having to talk about these issues as hard as they are, and bringing on leadership that could, really affect change. These are some of the things that, I feel like, this past year has really accelerated, and brought to the surface. I myself, work with Blue Star Families, for example, and, we have deployed fellowships now where we are, bringing together, our, military family members and others who, are going to bring diversity to our nonprofits who serve us. Which is
Amazing.
so
Yeah.
important, right? We're talking about these things. So, the past year has been a year of really reflecting, really trying to drive change, and really taking a good look at ourselves as a military community and asking, how did we get here? And, what do we do to make things better?
Right.
And, that the last year has been significant in that, in the face of that. I mean, some of, just to go back to a little bit of statistics, there was a survey conducted last year by the Air Force Inspector General on racial disparity, because we wanted to baseline, I guess, we wanted to know,
Right.
where are we now? And they found that, first of all, they had put out the survey, and in just 2 weeks, they had already received over 123,000 responses.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a reality for so many service members. 123,000 in 2 weeks. As a researcher, I'm telling you, that's huge.
That's huge, right?
You don't get that many responses, especially that quickly. But the findings were really eye-opening. So they found that 2 out of every 5 African Americans said that they did not trust their chain of command to address racism, bias, and unequal opportunities.
Wow.
That's huge. So, when you think about your chain of command, that's who you go to. When there's a concern, when there's something you want changed, something to be, that's who you go to. And 2 out of every 5 did not trust that they could go to, their leaders. And then 3 out of 5 said that, they did not feel that they received the same benefit of the doubt from their leaders as their white peers if they got into any kind of trouble.
Wow.
And that's frightening, because that really, makes you think of like a feeling of safety. So they're not feeling safe, to be able to really, ask for help if they need it, because they feel like they may not, be believed, or, they might not receive the same benefit of the doubt as their white peers.
Yeah.
And that's so disconcerting. And this is, throughout the ranks. And when you think about what I said earlier, that only 2 out of the 41 4-star generals are Black, that's unacceptable. When you think about the population at large, how many of our force are Black or African American, and yet you don't see them in, these positions of leadership. That's troubling.
Right.
And when you think about what I said, that January 6th, and there's a lot out there, so I won't go into great detail,
Right.
but, we're combating extremism in the ranks as well.
Right.
White supremacy. And, imagine, this is your career. This is something you're passionate about. You want to climb in the ranks. You want to feel safe. And these surveys are telling us, and these experiences from these leaders are saying, that is not the reality for our groups of color.
Right.
And that inevitably really translates to our families also feeling that way, reporting microaggressions, on a daily basis, on base, or in situations where, they may be one of, many
Yes.
people, families of color who struggle, because I'm thinking specifically about our Latino families. I conducted a sort of environmental scan just a few years back on my own, because as a Latina, as a Spanish speaker, I had often been asked to translate for military families who could not, get resources and information in the language that they understood in Spanish. And, there was nothing, absolutely nothing out there in terms of resources that they could access. And, think about it, most of us, a lot of us don't go to FRG meetings, but, if there's a deployment or something, they're the ones we go to when we need information, when say someone in our family is struggling with mental health because dad's gone or whatever it is.
Right.
So we go to the FRG for that. And, when they can't understand the language, or they can't offer resources to you in the language you understand, that's isolating.
It is.
And so, examples like these that really cause us to know that, what, this is huge. This is something, that needs to be addressed, is, and is being addressed, but gosh, we don't want this to be a flash in the pan. We don't want
Yes.
this to be, okay, because, there's been nationwide attention to this. Everyone's jumping on board and seeing what they can do. Let's keep that going. We don't want it to be a temporary fix. We need wholesale, large scale change.
Yes. I
And
love how you said that, wholesale, large scale change, because you're absolutely right. What tends to happen is the attention to these topics ebbs and flows, right? It's popular right now. It's what the media is covering in the moment. I know as a business owner, even you're seeing people now, it's exciting to partner with minority owned businesses, and even like you mentioned in our leadership, the timing was amazing for General Brown to now be in a position of leadership. And I think, all things are falling together as they should, and the tremendous opportunity that he has now versus had he taken command 5 years prior, he wouldn't be able to communicate the same messages. Would they have been well received? We don't know. And I love that you say this is not just something that we want to a flash in a pan. It's something that's hot right now. And then we continue to go about our lives, because you're absolutely right. This is kind of like the door was cracked opening. And now we're like prying the door open to talk about other issues, not just for our African Americans, but I loved how you talked about our Latin community, our Latinos. Like, there's still work to be done there, even in diversity groups that I'm a part of and I listen to, our Asian and our Pacific Islanders. There's a lot to be done there in those communities. And just like you said, that representation, having leadership in those positions, to where you can see someone who looks like you. And I think that would drastically also change that trust factor that survey showed. They're not as trusting of their leadership. Why? Because maybe they feel they cannot identify with the experiences that they have. Or, as we mentioned previously before we started chatting here on this interview, but even when it comes to your stand down days and acknowledging of things, it's hard to fully trust and embrace that your leadership is taking the situation seriously when they really don't have the context or haven't sought out to understand someone else, to walk in someone else's shoes, and to have real conversations when we're just checking the box on diversity. In years past, I feel like, being over as a spouse and as a GS, I've been over the private orgs where we do our observances. And how often is it like, okay, it's a holiday, let's check the box, let's put this banner up, and let's just say that we've recognized this thing. But I don't think there's intentional time spent saying, hey, let me understand what this observance really is meant to bring to the forefront, and how it's supposed to impact my daily life from this point forward. So I completely agree with you. And I think those were some huge lessons learned from 2020 that we will hopefully continue to carry out throughout this decade and just continue to improve, because the work is not done. Like, it's not going to be done in 1 year, with a couple of surveys and statements. Like, this is just informing us of the work that still needs to be done. So thank you for acknowledging that. I think that was completely spot on. So I guess my question then leads to, where do we kind of go from here? Like, we have the data that shows the distrust, or where we have some holes. We have the data to show that there's not representation on the military family side, as well as our active duty reserve and guard side from a leadership side. So kind of, where do we go from here?
it's really going to take, a very thoughtful effort, that, diversity becomes a no-brainer,
Yeah.
that we take into account diverse voices, diverse perspectives of every kind, and, bring them to the table. We need leadership, and we're starting to see some of that, but we need more leadership, more guidance. We need, more protections in place. I mentioned that because, obviously, if there is a discriminatory act, for example, we've got the Equal Employment Opportunity Office. And I had read a study that, several times more, I don't remember if it was 3 times or 4 times more of the civilian, so GS, were reporting EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity, issues, whereas the military wasn't. And part
Yeah.
of that is what we mentioned earlier, that they don't feel safe. Part of it is that, for them, they feel like it's ineffective. So let's study that. What about this is ineffective? What about this, beyond, what we already know, which is they don't feel safe. So how can we help them feel safe?
Yeah.
What are some legal protections we can put in place? What are, training opportunities that we could put in place? To train leaders, to train our line leaders, to train, I know that we get trained to death, but,
Yeah.
I really feel like there's still a gap. There's
Right.
still, there's still so much missing. And, let's continue, people like you and others who are so passionate about this, myself included, we have to continue to raise this issue. We can't stop. Um, yes, we're seeing changes, but it's nowhere near where it should be. This shouldn't even be a question. Like, we shouldn't be worried about diversity and discrimination or anything. The fact that we have to bring this up, we have to bring this to people's attention, that that people are feeling unsafe, that people are not feeling protected, that people are still experiencing this. That's unacceptable.
Yeah.
And I'm not bashing our military community. We are working hard to make
Yeah.
changes. This is nationwide, right? It's not just us. And I would love to see our leaders speak out more, not just our leaders of color.
Yes, that's a good
So,
one. Yeah.
we really need across the board our leaders saying this is a problem and this is what we're going to do to stop this. Because, somehow this extremism was allowed to fester and grow within our military ranks. How does that happen? So we really, really need leadership across the board, to say this does not reflect our military. This is
Yeah.
not who we are. And when it comes to our military families, I'd like to see a lot more diverse perspectives there as well.
Yeah.
It's important. When I did that, environmental scan and gap analysis on my own a few years back, it was disheartening to see that so few of us are even talking about that.
Yeah.
And, and I'm not just saying just for Spanish, we have, we have, military spouses who come from, Asia or Pacific Islander or other countries
Yes.
don't speak English, and, they would need resources. So, it has to be a consolidated effort from everyone, and we can all do something. That's the good news. Oftentimes when I talk about suicide prevention, which is what I do, we talk about how every single one of us can make a change. Every single one of us can make a change. I teach a diversity class at Pepperdine University. And, I always ask my students to attend, either a religious or LGBT or a cultural event from a culture that is not your own. Just go, immerse yourself, get to know other people
Yeah.
of diverse, religions and ethnicities and cultures. I think the more that we know about each other, the more that we learn about each other, the more that we'll see that we have way more in common than differences. And this is going to be this is something that has been an issue forever. You go to other
Yeah.
countries and there's, discrimination against, others there too. It's not like American thing, but,
Right,
you know,
right.
we, but we really, really coming together and in your own circles of influence, making them more diverse and talking about these things. And if you see discrimination, call it out. Don't just stand back, because that is what makes it continue to flourish and grow. Is that, we don't say anything. You're uncomfortable.
Mhm.
We'll get comfortable. We'll get comfortable talking about these things. It's
Exactly.
so important. And I think that's the only way that we're going to affect real change. Because if you think about the diversity of, we're becoming more and more diverse,
We are.
as time goes on. And so, this is our reality. Talk about it. Expand your own experiences. Lobby for things that you see that are continuing to support, racism, discrimination, and, just be a voice.
I love that. I absolutely love that. I think those were amazing just ways ahead. And if I can just break those down, some of the things that were noted here for those who are listening. One, we talked a little bit about adjusting some training so that it can be more impactful, immersing yourself in other cultures so that you are closer to someone else's experience. You can relate more with other people and empathize with them. Continuing the conversation, which I think is huge. And I'm grateful for you, Dr. Yi, being here to help us do that in this forum and continuing these conversations. And the last one is bringing the issues to light and being a voice. And I just want to encourage anyone who is listening to us, if any of these are hitting home for you, maybe you personally can be a voice. Maybe you can be the next spouse that steps out to be a key spouse or lead an FRG. If you are in a part of this minority population, maybe you're the face that we're waiting to see to help bridge the gap in this issue. And for those who are serving, who wear the uniform, not being afraid to step out and report things that you're seeing, having those tough conversations with leadership. And if you are a leader, communicating your perspective out. It's been so valuable. I know I was blessed to be in a squadron who has very diverse leadership. So when we had our stand down day, to hear the stories of first generation families who immigrated over and the reason why they wanted to serve and the impacts on those events in DC that happened to them. It was a beautiful display that leadership got to speak to airmen who, who again, like you mentioned, our enlisted forces. They are predominantly where our minorities fall, and to hear leadership communicate those messages that even at my level, how that impacted their lives, seeing the events that happened in Washington and the reason why they took that oath and the reason why they serve as minorities. It's amazing to see. So I'd encourage anyone who is in a position of leadership, whether that's leading a small unit and you're just in the beginning stages of leading, or if you are higher up and you are in commands in any level. I think it is really important to take away from this conversation to utilize that opportunity to talk about diversity, to talk about equity, to talk about inclusion, and how you could maybe be a piece of that puzzle that continues to improve and make a difference, as opposed to it just being something that's popular for the moment. We want to see real change. We want to see sustained improvement over time. And I'm so grateful, Dr. E, for you to bring that perspective, that research, and just kind of that professional perspective to this conversation, as it is so needed right now. So thank you so much for being a part of the conversation.
Thank you for having me. I really
Yes.
appreciate it.
And if you had any last thoughts to kind of wrap up our discussion, what would be maybe one takeaway that you would encourage for our listeners?
Yeah, I kind of alluded to it earlier, but just how important it is to not ignore this, how important it is to speak up and speak out. It's scary. I know it is. It can be scary, especially when you think about our service members who think it might impact their career. So, but it's so important to keep bringing this to light.
Yeah, that's such a good, important point. Thank you so much again for joining us. And we'll continue the conversation, continue to follow Dr. Yee and her work. We'll have all the links below so that you can follow her and be a part of that voice continuing to move this conversation forward. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Our next discussion will be with the one and only Charlinda Scales. I am excited that she is back with us a second year to have this very important discussion on race in the military community. Charlinda is an Air Force veteran, entrepreneur, servant leader, CEO, and all around friend to this community. I am glad that you have the opportunity to lean in, hear her perspective on the lessons learned that we have seen from 2020 to 2021. So let's jump into our discussion with her. Well, thank you so much, Charlinda, for being here. I'm so excited that you are joining us for the second year of this Military Family Talk Town Hall, this discussion on race in our military family and in our community. So we are going to dive right in with our first question, the big thoughts or idea for this forum, which is, what are our big lessons learned as a nation and a military community after the awakening that happened in 2020? What's the big lesson learned that we have at this point, almost a year later?
Well, the biggest takeaway that I had, 2020 was such a roller coaster, not only emotionally, culturally. There's so many walls that we broke through that sometimes take years. But, the unfortunate incident with George Floyd was kind of like a shattering of so many walls, because there were so many things, the tale of two Americas. We were living in two different countries, two different existences in the same country. And it's like we really weren't getting through to each other as citizens, as races, as Americans, all living next to each other. Sometimes it could be someone you're working day to day with, in uniform with, at your neighbor, your neighbor at your house. And conversations are now starting that are very surprising. Oh, I didn't know that your life was like that. I didn't know that things were like that. I didn't know that you had to go through so many steps just to get the same result that we naturally do. So I like the fact that the conversations started on a massive scale, not just America. It's a global conversation.
Yes.
The response that we got from the George Floyd incident on a global scale, it actually made me feel great as a person. I'm like, overall, people know right from wrong, good from bad. And when you see something, say something. If something isn't right, say it isn't right. That's the only way that we're going to get to this idea of equality that we've been striving for since the beginning. And I liked it. It started off rough. We're already dealing with COVID and all this other stuff. We're trying to hold our own families together on top of dealing with this. So I'm glad that the conversations began. I'm glad that we had kind of a breakthrough.
Yeah. And I think that is a good lesson learned, even as we look at the situation. You brought up the fact that this is a global conversation and the global conversation happened. And I think that is a good lesson learned, especially for African Americans in the space. When you looked around at the images of those who were protesting, and you looked at the images from across the, over in different countries who had a voice, it was diverse. It was a lot of different age groups, a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of people were vocal during that time frame, and I think that was a huge lesson learned. One, to for it to be at the forefront at that level, to say this is not just one race's problem. This is a world issue. And I love that you said that. And it's absolutely a great lesson learned for us. And then the second lesson learned that you pointed out is that the conversation is finally starting with these two different Americas. Now, I think that was huge for us in 2020, and even carrying it into 2021 as our leadership continues to talk about the issue, which is great. And hopefully what I hope we start to see is somewhat of a merging, so that these two separate worlds start to get a little closer together. So I think that was spot on when it comes to a lesson learned. So as a veteran, as a entrepreneur, business owner, what did you see implemented that you thought was a step in the right direction?
No, I do like the acknowledgement that it was hard for us over time to get on the same footing when it comes to building wealth with our families. And I couldn't tell you how many times I had the conversation where the light bulb came on for one of my friends who was not a minority, that housing discrimination existed, wealth discrimination existed, redlining. So the term redlining
Correct.
was just starting. I'm like, how are we in 2020 and people are just learning about it? So it wasn't just, we weren't just saying the odds were stacked against us in our feelings. Like, you can look at the data across history in our country, and finally people are saying, oh, let's take a look at it.
Yes.
Let's take a
Yes.
look at it. So as a business owner, because they're finally taking a look at it, they're finally starting to implement things to level the playing field, to say, you know what, it shouldn't be so hard for you to get a business loan. You know, it really shouldn't be hard for you to grow your company and get capital. We're
Mhm.
going to provide means for you to prosper, and not have to have so many stepping stones. It shouldn't be, the American dream belongs to everyone.
Right.
And I know that at some point we should all be able to just walk into whatever bank, walk wherever, to have the same pitch meetings. And it's not a thing whether you're Black or brown or Latina or whatever your background is. It shouldn't be a thing. So we'll talk about moving forward, but that, to me, I was like, it shouldn't be a thing. But right
Right.
now it is, and I'm glad that people are waking up to that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I really was impressed with how in the business world there was a lot of new partnerships that were formed. There were a lot of major platforms. Some did and some didn't. We watched, we noted, but a lot of big platforms acknowledged the lack of representation,
Mhm.
the lack of leadership that they had, the an inclusion that they had for certain ad campaigns, or when they did give money and grants, they acknowledged the disparities there. And I am, as a entrepreneur myself, I am grateful that that was something that was implemented. There are some, especially you mentioned our financial institutions as well. They are taking steps with major grant programs. That's not a one and done. A lot of these are like 5 and 10-year programs that they've implemented, specifically investing in our minority businesses. And for any of our veteran owned, military spouse owned minority businesses that are watching, this is something that you should absolutely take advantage of. It is a positive that came out of such a negative situation. And I think one of the tones that kind of come with this discussion is it's about time. It's about time that some of these things have been implemented to help level the playing field.
Yep.
And I hope that this conversation even encourages someone to take advantage of some of the things that are being implemented.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So we can keep going and talk to, we did the lesson learned, we talked about what was implemented. Now I want to know from your perspective, kind of where do we go from here? What are some things, some next steps even that you would envision that we could have, whether it be in our military community, in our nation overall? What are some next steps, or where would we go from the progress and kind of the momentum that's been building thus far?
Well, I think tiny steps, tiny movements can still make waves. And I've seen these happening in the military, especially. I've been watching what the Air Force is doing. I'm an Air Force veteran. We have General C.Q. Brown. We also have Minority SecDef right now. I just saw that women's hair regs changed, and
Yes.
we were like, what's the big deal? But when you've been at boot camp like I was, and you're in the bathroom late that night, the first day of boot camp, crying and shaving your head like G.I. Jane because they don't understand that your micro braids are in regulations, and rather than fighting with people, you just cut off your hair. And for, being a minority, that is, your hair is everything, like everything. And that was, you start out the time in a very important step in your life, just morally defeated just because of that. So the step that they made, saying we're going to relax the hair regulations, not only that, we're taking into consideration the bulk, because African-American minority hair is different. It's more
That
porous.
was so good. I appreciated the bulk. Yes.
Right. They were like, okay, it's
6
not
inches.
just they can put it in a
Yes.
ponytail. They put it in a ponytail. It's like, okay, so we have to pay attention to that. We
Yes.
want them to be able to serve and not have to think about the odds being stacked against them when they walk in the door, a headache because they have 5 billion bobby pins in their head.
That part.
Stuff like that. It just makes me feel great. I spent 2020, I was in a lot of different programs. Because of COVID, they were virtual. I wouldn't have been able to afford flying to all these places where these programs were. That was
Right.
one thing. 2, I was sponsored by big corporations that were saying, we need to have people like her in the room. And I had already started an apparel brand. It's the Empower Collection. And our motto is change the conversation, change the world. And we have our little hashtag be in the room, because that was a challenge I was given in one of the classes was, what do you do personally to move things forward? I said, well, the first thing is we need to be in the room. If we're not in the room, we can't influence things. It's group think in some of these places, in some of these boardrooms, there's group think. They're coming out with marketing things. You can tell they're marketing for minorities, but there was not one minority in that room. When that ad.
Yes. Yes.
And they're getting, what is that? They're getting canceled because they're finding out on the end, maybe we should have included them in the process.
Right.
And so I said, there's so much power in just be in the room. Do what you can to be in the room. If you look at something like a board of advisors or a board of directors, and you're like, I don't want to be on that. There's no one that looks like me. Well, there will be if you decide to be on the board.
That's good. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's how you change the conversation, because when you're in the room, the conversation changes. Your input does matter. It can, even if it's a couple inches, move it, move the goal line, do something. So yeah, that's what I see going forward. We all have to do our part to keep changing the conversation, to not only change the conversation, but be open, because that's another thing. I think stereotypically, they want to say that it's hard to approach us to have the conversation. Maybe it's too hard, or it's going to be contentious, but you have to allow for questions, because there's a difference between, someone who grew up not knowing. You don't know what you don't know. So sometimes people are speaking out of just a lack of knowledge, and you have to have discernment know when they're genuinely curious. You could be the first person that they are ever brave enough to ask, and
That's
whatever
so
you
true.
say to them is what they're going to walk away and
Mhm.
forever be changed in how they interact with other people. So you also want to be that person that they can have that game changer conversation with. And the future, I tell people, I was talking to my grandmother one time and I was just speaking about a soccer game. And I said, oh, we were so thirsty and everybody was drinking out of this jug. And she was like, what? And I had gone on to telling her more about the story, but she was stuck. She was stuck on the fact that she said, y'all were all allowed to drink out of the same jug. And I looked at her like, yeah, to me, it was just the craziest thought. Why wouldn't we?
Right.
The foreign didn't make sense. I don't see why that was even a thing. I look at that the same way that I look at race. And I'm proud to say I look at racial issues with a very condescending attitude, because having a problem with someone because of what you look like is beneath me. And I want it to be something people are like, I do not want to waste my life and my time and what I'm here to do and my limited time on earth to be arguing over your tan or your melanin versus my lack of or abundance of melanin. That is just asinine. That is not even, it's not worth our time. And I want the whole world to get to a point where race is something that a less evolved species of humans used to do.
That's that's so good right there. I completely agree with you. I love the next steps that you point out. So I'm gonna break it down for everybody if you missed any of it. Those tiny moments that you talked about, those tiny steps, I completely agree with that, because I feel like if we did any major changes, right, if we took these big leaps, we would get a lot of pushback and they wouldn't be sustainable change. So I like those small steps that you noted, so that we could have some sustainable change. I like that you talked about how we made efforts to do a lot more things virtually, and it gave people the opportunity to be in the room. Y'all go ahead and hashtag that, be in the room. That is a major next step. I completely agree, because we definitely need to have more representation, more of a presence in different spaces, and that is an amazing next step. And I love the be open for questions, to give your perspective. Again, to all of my minorities out there, don't feel like you bear the burden of speaking on behalf of the entire race. Give your perspective, be open to share what you have experienced. And I know personally, I have had those conversations and I had to shine a light on some of my own personal experiences with others, because they felt comfortable talking to me about it. And I had to be open and somewhat uncomfortable to be put on the spot, because I was not expecting for them to ask me these questions. But I knew it came from a place of they genuinely wanted to understand. They genuinely cared about me, and if this was something that I experienced, or if this is something that has impacted myself or my family as we've served, in and out of the uniform, whatever that looks like. And that's really huge, to be open and receive, and willing to have those conversations like we're doing now. I really do hope that conversations like we are having is something that kind of sparks other conversations, even outside of this platform, with the people that are right there with you in your union, in your squadrons, on your block, in your home. Have the conversations, talk about the small steps that are being made, and look to see how could you even be a part of making that small step happen for someone else. I know with you being a business owner and having a platform, and me having a platform, even being a minority, I feel like there's a responsibility to reach back and look and see like who else is in the space, because I got a seat at this table. Who can I pull a chair up to have at this table too? So when we have these conversations about race, And we're not just talking about an us versus them. We're talking about even what can we do as minorities to continue the conversation, to continue to progress this dialogue, and to include other people as representation. And I hope that everyone takes from this dialogue that we all play a part. It's a conversation that needs to continue, and we definitely all play a part in the conversation.
Absolutely.
So, Charlinda, before we wrap up, I would love to know any final thoughts, any big takeaways that you want our listeners to walk away from this discussion, knowing and or doing.
Well, definitely be in the room. Challenge yourself. There's room for everybody to eat. I tell that to entrepreneurs, especially minorities, because there's so many things. There's so many ways for you to be successful. I see stuff that come across my desk. I'm like, I can't do that, but I know somebody who could. And rather than just let it be a thought, take action on it. You know, send them that grant, send them that application. Do what you can. If you teach someone something that you know, it doesn't make it's not a competition. It's not building a competitor. It's saying, you know what, I want you to be the best at whatever your gift is, and I'm going to add some tools to your toolbox to get you there. We've already have a path that's destined for us. What's for you is for you. There's nothing that's going to deter you from it except for yourself. So
good.
You just need to stay focused on that, because I just see too many times people are, you know, we're all in the pool and you're swimming, you're looking at what they're doing, you're looking at what they're doing. You think that if you teach them how to swim better, that somehow this becomes a race between you and them. No, stay in your lane.
So good.
You're in your own lane. And this is not a race you're all headed in the same direction.
That's right. I love that. I love that. Super encouraging. And I just have to foot stop again. We need to check out that Empowering Collection, that hashtag be in the room. We'll make sure that we link it for this discussion. But I think that is a great takeaway, great next steps that we can each take, regardless of where you sit in minority, brown, Black, however you identify in your racial background. We can all take away those next steps. We can all continue this conversation, and we can definitely all support one another in sharing. Like you said, it costs you nothing to send that person that grant application, that opportunity, but you staying in your lane absolutely will allow all of us to run the race successfully. And running our own race is what we really need to be focused on. So that's so good.
Yeah. We're gonna make it, all of us.
That's right. We are stronger together, and I'm super grateful for you. Thank you for your time, for sharing with us for the second year of the Military Family Town Hall on race.
Thanks, Bree. Appreciate you, sis.
All right, everyone, we are going to get started with a very special segment for this Military Family Town Hall, this discussion on race. And I am excited to introduce you to two members of my family to take part in this discussion. So first, we have Lieutenant Colonel Kendrick Carroll and Captain Donovan Carroll joining us for the segment. So the first question that I have, Kenny, I will pose it to you. What were your feelings in 2020 regarding the racial tension and awakening of the nation? And what do you believe we've learned today? Like a year later, what do you think we've learned as a nation, as a military community?
So my perspective is going to be different than others. So everybody's got their own lens through which they viewed the events of 2020. I think COVID being the easy one. One thing that I learned is that we are so much more dependent upon each other than we ever realized. Think about all the supply shortages that we had. Some of the supply shortages that we're still experiencing today, and it's already a brand new year. In some cases, we were minimally manned up until the vaccinations. Once the vaccinations rolled out, we were still dependent on everybody to actually accept the vaccination, and our manning was dependent upon it. So somehow that became political. So what I learned is, it's a very good thing that we take an oath to the Constitution, not necessarily a political party. If you remember, all the events that happened with the insurrection on the Capitol, that was an eye-opening experience for a lot of people. And I'll just be honest with you, from my little foxhole, for me, it wasn't necessarily an eye-opening experience, because I accepted very many years ago that the military, and this is where some people were shocked that they were actually military members, a part of it. And I tell people that the military is still a microcosm of American society. So military members bring with them their cultures, their values when they join, right? So we have to accept it, just like there were those folks with those cultures and beliefs and values that thought it was a good idea to sack the Capitol and be a part of the insurrection. Some of them thought they were doing the right thing, I'm sure. I would argue that many of us disagreed with that perspective. But what I did learn is it doesn't just, because you wear the uniform, because you're part of the military, it doesn't exempt you from some of those extreme beliefs on both sides of the aisle, if you will, to use a common vernacular. So what I learned is we absolutely depended upon each other, and because we wear the uniform, it doesn't alleviate us from being exposed or susceptible to a lot of those strong beliefs and values that the rest of America was subjected to throughout the last year in the middle of a pandemic as well.
Yeah, that's really good perspective. I think we can all agree that we've seen that in one way, shape, or form, just being reliant upon one another. I know even I mentioned with another panelist, even with how people reacted in protests and things, change was seen in this short period of time because of the diversity in age, in group, and ethnicity for those who lended their voice to this shift in the nation. So I could definitely see how being dependent on one another is a big takeaway for this. And I definitely appreciate your transparency with not necessarily being surprised with how those events at the Capitol played out, whereas some people really were shocked and surprised at the actions that were taking place. So Donovan, my question to you as it relates to race, what were some things that you saw implemented in our branch in the Air Force that you thought were steps in the right direction, whether that be steps from leadership, steps from people in your peer group? What were some steps that you thought were positive that came out of these events?
So I think the first thing that I saw was the implementation of diversity surveys, right? And getting the perspective of your minority members and giving them the avenue to actually come forward and say, like, yes, I've experienced, certain kinds of treatment along the way. And
Yeah.
the first part of correcting a problem is acknowledging that you have one. So with that, I think opening up that avenue for people to come forward truthfully and say, these are some of the things that I experienced, it's given the rest of us the opportunity to get together and have those discussions on a one-on-one level. So that's definitely something I've seen within my squadron here most recently with some of, like, for example, the extremism down days, or just days that we've been able to just set aside and just talk and actually be truthful and forthcoming, because I think a lot of people will acknowledge that these things happen, but if you don't see it day in and day out, it's difficult for you to acknowledge that we actually have that problem. So being able to sit across the table from your counterparts and say, I've experienced these things has really been eye-opening. And while I will admit we still have a long way to go, I think it was definitely a step in the right direction for us.
Yeah, I would agree. I think just from serving in a GS role, even with the last stand down day, I saw some really positive conversations come out of that. I know a lot of people may have had different experiences. It really depended on how much the leaders of those stand down days ran with it, how they decided to implement the material that was provided. But I agree. I saw a lot of really healthy one-on-one conversations. And I think to get at the root of some of the issues that we're seeing in our nation, in our armed forces, as it relates to race, it takes those one-on-one discussions where people can just be transparent and share their experiences. Because I think in shared experiences, I think you already relate with your crew, the people that you're working with in your squadrons. You already have some type of common ground. And then to say, oh, somebody that I serve with in this on this level has experienced that. I think it was shocking to even some of the airmen that I've heard, some of the conversations and experience that they have, being younger enlisted members, as it was the opposite with some of the officers that were not minorities. They learned a lot from that crosstalk. So I thought that was really good. So the question that I have for everyone is kind of, what are some of the things that you've been intentional about doing? And kind of what are some practical next steps for our military families as a takeaway from this overall discussion on race in the military family? I'll go first. I know one of the messages that I will continue to champion as the 2020-2021 Armed Forces Insurance Air Force Spouse of the Year, and as a minority doing so, is that you have to be okay with being the only one in the room. And I know a lot of my minority spouses who serve alongside me in leadership roles and positions, we have the common story of oftentimes we are the only one who is a key spouse that is a minority, the only one who is in a leadership role in a spouse club, or the only one who has the opportunity to speak and lend a voice with leadership. And I think being okay with that and encouraging other people the opportunity to do so is huge. And if I can just add on to that, also, if I have a seat at the table, being willing to bring that chair up to the table for someone else, another minority that maybe doesn't look like me, but is also of a different group, minority group, giving them the opportunity to kind of speak up and speak out. I think that's a huge takeaway that I think I for a little bit took for granted prior to this awakening, if you will, that now I take a lot more seriously, just because it's that much more important to keep conversations like this going and to get that diverse perspective while we're making decisions for our families and for the mission. Kenny, what would you say you've been more intentional about, or what are some next steps that you would encourage our military community and families to kind of take from this discussion?
So when Secretary Austin directed the extremism stand down, I was actually excited. You talk about being comfortable being the only minority in the room. I often tell the story when I was in command. I was the commander of a squadron out in the Nellis at the weapons school, and 6'2" black guy in a room full of non-minority officers, aviators, right? So even before the directed extremism stand down, I would have very frank conversations with the airmen in my squadron, and not for my sake, but for their sake, because the majority of my squadron were officers. There were some enlisted, but I would say 75-80% of the squadron were officers, so future leaders of our Air Force. So my intent was to capitalize on the opportunity that I had to prepare them for their leadership roles in the environment in which that they were going to enter once they became DOs and commanders. So I didn't want them to enter to a squadron that was very different than the squadron we had, right? So that squadron, again, the only minority, that minority happened to be the commander, but I was in a squadron that was about 90% white, about 95% male, and there were only one or two females, depending on the time in the year during my command tenure. So I told them very frankly, look, your squadrons will not look like this unless you come back to command this same squadron. Your squadrons will have Black people, white people, Asian people, heterosexuals, homosexuals, atheists, believers, you name it. And I don't want you to be unprepared to lead airmen, because all airmen deserve your leadership. And so when we had the extremism stand down directed by Secretary Austin, I'll tell you again, from my perspective, it got mixed reviews. because as you mentioned earlier, it was very much up to the local leadership as to how well that went, right? And so I thought it was a great step in the right direction. But if you really mean it, I think, and this is where I think I'm answering your question now, what are some of the practical steps? If you really mean it, allow those tough discussions on a reoccurring basis and have a deliberate feedback mechanism so that if an airman of any color, any gender, any sexual orientation has a concern, they have a very deliberate and, more importantly, a predictable way to understand what that feedback mechanism is. So when I have that concern, I voice my concern, I can anticipate the very deliberate methods and timelines associated with it, some sort of feedback. So our revisit rate must increase. I think we have to have those conversations more often in both deliberate, sit down sessions, and frankly, around the bar with a beer in your hand, I think is still an appropriate way to have those conversations so that we can ask some of those very pointed, very uncomfortable questions and get them asked and answered, right, by some of the folks in the room that have the tangible answers. About a year ago, you mentioned earlier, we had this discussion right after the Ahmaud Arbery shooting, right? And we had very senior leaders as a part of that discussion. And I asked them, I said, great, it's a hot topic now, and I appreciate your candor, and I appreciate you being a part of the discussion. But my question to them was, where were you before? And when this all goes away and the media finds something else to talk about, where will you be then, right? So here, if I had to give kind of some tangible things to them if they were still listening, or even to spouses groups, or frankly to parents of your of minority children, or any child for that matter, you've got to be able to identify the signs of non-inclusive behavior. I won't just jump to the extremist behavior, but non-inclusive, right? There's a spectrum from just simple biases. I don't like this. I don't like hot dogs. So people with hot dogs are immediately, less credible in my opinion than, people that eat, hamburgers. Very simplistic analogy, but there is absolutely a spectrum. So remember, right, we are a microcosm, the military is, of the American population. So each one of us comes with our own values and cultures and beliefs, not just the ones wearing the uniforms, but the family members and that come along with us. So our nation, military, they need and deserve all of our talents. And so we lose the benefit of the talents that minorities bring when those talented people give up and they go and take their talents elsewhere, right? Because they are talented, they have other options. The military is not the only option for folks that are talented. And some of the most talented people you ever want to meet, wear this uniform or support, like yourself, those folks that are wearing the uniform of our nation. So I think finally, it's no longer good enough to simply say, well, I'm not racist. Great. I've never sexually assaulted anyone either. However, that's not good enough, right? If I am aware that another member is being sexually assaulted, right? It would be incumbent upon me to take action against that, right? So I think we need to look for the signs, intervene just like you would in a SAPR type situation, and then frankly stop the overt and the covert discrimination. So take a debrief mentality, meaning identify what that problem is. What are those contributing factors to the problem? And then, if we can, determine what the root cause is, and most importantly, start to apply the tangible fix. And just like you don't get fat overnight, to use a gym analogy, you don't get skinny overnight. So I think realistic expectation management is absolutely paramount. Where, even a big boat with a little rudder, it'll eventually change course. And so you have to keep putting those control inputs in order to get our culture, our American culture, and our military culture to change course, to stamp out that either conscious or unconscious bias, and ultimately, right, to rid our military family of any extremist behavior. Long answer to a short question. I apologize.
No, I think that was spot on. I definitely agree with the practical steps that you gave. You laid out a couple, you hit different areas, everything from our leadership to the common person who leads even the smallest group of people. So I think that was really good. Donovan, what would you kind of close us out, wrapping up some intentional steps, some practical steps from your perspective that you would like to see even as we continue this conversation on race?
Yeah, so honestly, I'm going to echo a lot of points that you guys have already made, right? It's a continuing discussion that we have to have. It's not going to get fixed right now. It's not going to happen if we only sit and have these discussions once a quarter. It's something that we have to be intentional about. But I would also encourage people to realize that diversity is what makes us stronger. So don't view it as, I am being forced to take on the views of others, or or going to great lengths to do something that you're not per se comfortable with. But I think if you view it from a standpoint of, my overall intent is to strengthen my organization, how am I going to be able to do that? Well, the answer is by soliciting that input from people who have those differing backgrounds, who don't look like me, who don't think like me, and realize that that is going to further mold you and shape you into the person that you want to be. So that, I think that applies to both people in uniform and out of uniform, for our as families as well that support us, right? Don't be afraid to have a friend that does not look like you, that does not think like you.
Yeah.
Maybe they are on the opposite side of the aisle in political views or something like that. I think there's something to be learned from having those interactions with people that don't necessarily think in the same way that we do, or operate or look like we do.
Yeah.
So that's what makes this country great, and that's what makes us the strong force that we are, is that we don't all look alike, and thus act the same way, think the same way. So that's what makes us a lethal force, for sure.
I love that. And I am grateful just to have the opportunity to have this discussion with my family. Thank you both for participating in the Military Family Town Hall discussions on race. This will wrap us up. If you have any questions regarding the topics that we've discussed here, please feel free, comment below, slide a DM in my inbox. I can definitely point you in the right direction, provide you with some resources, and get you connected with some SMEs. If you would like to have a forum like this in your own club, at your installation, wherever you feel the need to continue this conversation, please allow us to support you in doing so, because it's a very worthy topic. As we close out, I just want to say to everyone a happy Juneteenth, and look out for more that we will have on this discussion.